In 2023, I published a book on the Battle of Pinkie in 1547, along with two good friends and colleagues, Vicky Alexi, who's an archaeologist who works for AOC locally, and Bess Rhodes of St Andrews University. And we entitled the book The Last Battle Between the Independent Kingdoms of Scotland and England, as indeed it was. And it is a battle which I think is very important in several ways, but it's not particularly well known in Scotland. Um, Basically, it was a battle between the Scots and the English. The English came and thumped us, and that was it. And you might wonder why we need to know much more than that. It was just one of a long series of conflicts between us and our friends and neighbours south of the border. But I think it's important when we're building up an overview of what happened in the past that we study in detail all the little building blocks that make up that overall history, that we ask ourselves, that we ask questions of, well, how do we know what happened? Are we sure we got it right? Is there a lot more to be learnt if we do a study of where these events happened and who was involved? And that's what Vicky and Bess and I were trying to do in this case. Now, has that moved on to the next slide? It has, good.
It
Right,
has,
okay.
yes.
Right, thank you. Right, I can see it now. So it was a battle, Scotland versus England. And the particular context was that there was a very young queen, a baby queen in Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots. And from the beginning of 1547, a young English king, Edward VI. And a number of people, lots of people in both countries, saw that this was a wonderful opportunity to unite the kingdoms of Scotland and England through a marriage. And this was actually agreed by treaty in 1543. And it could well have turned out to be a wonderful thing. But we Scots moved away from this. We reneged on the treaty, much to the fury of Henry VIII of England, who subjected us to various campaigns of destruction and warfare. And after he died at the beginning of 1547, ruling England on behalf of the young Edward VI, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, decided to pursue this yet further. Um, Seymour reckoned that the way to actually beat us into actually giving up our queen to be married and brought up in England was to try and establish a pale, an area in the south of Scotland which was controlled from a series of English forts. And by good reason, we Scots would be brought round to think, well, actually, the English are not so bad, and this is probably a very good thing. Now, caught up in all this are very much bigger issues about the Reformation, the changes in religion, the fact that the countries were riven between people who wanted new Protestant ways in religion and people who wanted to stick to the old Church of Rome, all sorts of different issues of that sort. Seymour himself is quite an interesting character. He was from a reasonably humble background, as it were, but he had been a very successful soldier for Henry VIII, and now as effective ruler of England. He had an immense amount of power and influence and a group of people around him who he could rely on to help him pursue military endeavours. And he does seem to have been passionately interested in the idea that he could reason with us Scots, encourage us to become a Protestant nation like England. And it's quite striking that unlike elsewhere in Northern Europe, where the English indulged in what we would now call ethnic cleaning, or displacement of populations in Ireland and the north of France. We've got no evidence that that was the intention in Scotland, that in English terms, they were actually probably trying to be quite nice to us, believe it or not. Ruling Scotland on behalf of the baby Queen of Scots was James Hamilton, the Earl of Arne, a youngish man, perhaps lacking in experience, and it was clearly his job to defend the country against English aggression. Um, and so we were heading for a quite a major political storm, and in 1547 it resulted in the Battle of Pinkie. Now, for a long time, our main source of information on the Battle of Pinkie has been through the lens of a very distinguished historian in the first half of the 20th century, Sir Charles Oman, who was Professor of Modern History at Oxford and had a considerable and justified reputation as a military historian. And Oman wrote about the Battle of Pinkie on more than one occasion. And subsequent historians have tended to take the viewpoint, oh, well, Ormond's told us all about it. He's such an authority. We don't actually have to delve into this much ourselves, which is always a bad mistake, it seems to me, in historical studies, no matter how illustrious or distinguished your predecessors are. You've got to ask questions, you've got to look at what they've done. And in my humble opinion, Ormond did a very bad job in the case of Pinkie. I think it's pretty clear he never visited the place. This is the map that he produced of the battle. And for those of you who live around Musselburgh or that region, you might find it quite difficult to identify what the map is actually showing. It doesn't bear much relationship to Ordnance Survey maps, nor do the troop employments he's showing show much relationship to the sources that Oman was using. It's all sorts of problems that one can identify in Oman's work in the case of Pinkie, not least that he had a very partisan view, a very English centric view, which is a pity for somebody who was brought up in the British Empire, it seems to me. But some of the main things that we learn from Oman, which are fair enough, is that Somerset invaded Scotland from Berwick with a large powerful army. He came up the east coast. He encountered the Scottish army under the Earl of Arne at Musselburgh, and to his surprise, the Scots advanced from quite a strong position to meet the English in battle. There was a bit of a standoff. There was a cavalry engagement where the English actually came off worse, and it looked like we Scots were liable to win a famous victory, actually, on the 10th of September. And then something went wrong. The Scottish army basically collapsed, and we did a runner. And there were bodies and bits of equipment and weapons strewn all the way from Inverness all the way back to Edinburgh. And the English under Somerset were left in control of the field and apparently in a position to take control of Scotland and decide what would happen next. Those are some of the bare outlines of what happened. But as I say, it seemed to me and my colleagues that it was worth looking at this in more detail. And one of the reasons why we started taking a particular interest in it was because of Historic Environment Scotland and their requirement to record the battlefield of Pinkie on an inventory of notable Scottish battle sites. And our colleagues there have done an immense amount of important work since 2011 and have consulted widely in coming up with an explanation of what might be important and where exactly the battle took place. And this is what they've produced, an area surrounded by that dotted line, which they think is the area of importance and where very careful consideration has got to be given to future developments to preserve this important battlefield site. And they are continuing to consult and cooperate with local interest groups and people. And it is important to understand that our contribution is not by any means the end of the story. There's got to be ongoing discussion and hopefully research as we go forward. But you note that the area of the battlefield that they've marked out doesn't even include all the significant area relating to the battle on the 10th of September as they saw it. That orangish reddish area there marks the best guess as to where the English camp was, up by Goshen, up near Preston Pans, and a large sort of purplish area to the west of the River Esk represents the approximate area of the Scottish camp. And by the way, camps, army camps for these armies was not just a few tents or a small area. There's good reason to think, for instance, that the area of the Scottish camp would have been 1 to 1.5 square miles to include all the troops and horses, not to mention other people who might have been there, including merchants and sightseers and so on. And when one considers the battle in a wider context, it's not just about the two armies looking each other in the eye on a particular day. In actual fact, the battle took place over 2 days, you might say, and there was a period for several days beforehand. For instance, when the English were advancing up from Berwick by Reston and Dunbar, where they were being assailed by the Scots on a daily basis, and there was serious fighting. Um, and at the same time, not shown on this map, there was another English invasion force, a much smaller one, that was going into the southwest of Scotland, um, down in the region of Annandale. And this was a serious problem for Scottish planners, for Arne to know what to do. Um, Arne, in fact, decided to place his army in the days before the English arrived at Fala. You can just see it up in here in the moors and the Lammermuir Hills. Um, and there's a view of Fala looking across the Lothian plain towards the Pentland Hills. And this, I think, was a fairly traditional place for the Scots to gather their armies. And Anne had to make the decision as to, did he have to move his troops down to the southwest, or did he have to move them eastwards to receive the English invasion?
Yeah.
Now, I showed you earlier on the inventory entry produced by Historic Environment Scotland showing a reasonably large area near Musselburgh, um, which they think is the area of interest and within which the serious fighting took place. And so it did. I mean, that's how things were. But there's very few specific points that we can learn from early documentation as to where exactly this area was or where the main events took place. And here are four of the surviving key points, if you like, that are fairly incontrovertible, which help guide us as to where the battle took place. There's St Michael's Church at Inveresk, just inland from Musselburgh. That's a view of the previous medieval church, which was knocked down in the 19th century, but it hasn't moved position. It's on quite an interesting hillock to the east of the River Esk, quite a defensible position, site of a Roman fort and later fortifications after the Battle of Pinkie. There's Fosside Castle. It's been restored since this drawing was made in the 19th century. What you see at Fosside Castle is essentially a 20th century reconstruction of later 16th and 17th century castle. But nevertheless, it marks the site of a tower house that was there during the battle and figured in the fighting because the Scots were firing from the castle on the English who were camped nearby. Then there's the so-called Roman Bridge, the only crossing point in earlier times across the River Esk between the mouth of the river and basically up to Dalkeith and beyond. And it's not a Roman bridge, and the bridge you see now probably contains a lot of the structure of the bridge that was there in 1547. That's about the best we can say about it. But it was of major importance in terms of routeways because you could march people across that, and more importantly, you could take carts and pieces of artillery and horses across it. It was of crucial importance in marking the route from the east up to Edinburgh. And then finally, there's the settlement of Musselburgh itself. Of course, just about everything in Musselburgh is of more recent date than 1547, with the exception of the tower of the Tolbooth, which interestingly appears to have had a clock on it by 1547. And I just mention that because some of the early accounts mention that things took place at particular times of the day, like at 8 o'clock in the morning or at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And on a rather dreary September day, you might wonder, how the hell did they know that? Well, of course, they may have been guessing, but one possibility is that the clock was striking the hours, and that was one of the ways they knew what's happening. So these provide a certain amount of anchorage, if you like, in which within which events were taking place. However, one of the key things to say is that um, the landscape of 1547 has long since disappeared. It has been totally obliterated in lots of different ways. Even the coastline has changed. We know that in the 17th century, there was very considerable estate remodeling. There was river courses were changed. There was reclamation work. There was very considerable earth moving. And in the 19th century, there was a railway put through, all sorts of things. But a lot of it is now built up area. And this is a classic example of the sort of things that can happen. This is 1985 when the present version of the A1 was put through. And look at that incredible swathe of land that was basically bulldozed and stuff shifted around to put in the modern road. Now, I mention all this because while it's important to that we should remember and make sure people know about the Battle of Pinkie and understand it, part of that understanding does not relate to a landscape which is still there. It's not there. It has changed so enormously since the 16th century. And it would be nice to say that archaeological research could it would help us, and there has been a lot of archaeological research. There's the inventory area again, and all those blue bits mark where there's been significant archaeological intervention in recent years. Metal detector surveys, actual digging of trenches for various reasons to try and get some glimpse of what was happening in this area in earlier times. Now, of course, it's very important to do this work. And I'm an optimist. I still think that there is considerable scope for archaeology to provide some of the answers that we need. But so far, it hasn't produced any very helpful results. There's been several pieces of lead shot found, for instance, like these ones along the bottom, some of them evidently battered from use. But the trouble with pieces of lead shot is that by and large they could be any date from the late 15th up to the 19th century. And there's not a field in lowland Scotland where you couldn't pick up lead balls like this fired by people out shooting or poaching or whatever. So, and you cannot date them on the basis of the size or the composition, at least not yet. Cannot say who fired them, and they don't provide us with very much help. There are admittedly a handful of pieces of shot fired by small pieces of artillery. I think there's three of them, which are what we call composite shots, made of iron cubes wrapped in lead. And this is a particular technique that was used in the 16th century. But the 16th century doesn't take you to an hour or a day in one year in the 16th century. And we know that there's been a lot of military activity in this area over a very long period of time and considerable opportunity for stuff to be shifted around. Worse than that, we also know from records in the 19th century that the local farmers, quite shrewdly, would do deals with the city of Edinburgh to remove what was optimistically called the night earth from the streets of Edinburgh, dung, manure, to spread in their fields. So even when you find in this area, as one occasionally does, medieval pieces like that rim from a chafing dish, the chances are it comes from the streets of Edinburgh rather than anything to do with anything local in the 16th century. And in any case, how many soldiers on either side, how many troops on either side do you think had a chafing dish in their rucksack? Not many, I would suggest.
Mm.
One or two very interesting things worth further research if we have the opportunity. And there's one of the ones I rather like. It's actually silver and there's some traces of red enamel on it. It's what you might call a Tudor a Tudor rose. And I do wonder if it might be a badge from a horse, an English horse of the period. And we can hope that more evidence of that sort might turn up. So we go back to looking at some of the historical sources to see what we can make of them. And the main source that was used by Charles Oman and most other people who've written about the battle has been an incredible book by one William Patton, who was actually what you might call a staff officer in the English army, a scholar, your original war correspondent, who by any standards wrote one of the best accounts of a military campaign there's ever been. And this is about the first very detailed account of what happened, very well informed. And not only did he write the account, but he also illustrated it with these three what he calls tables showing the development of the battle. And this is totally unique for the period. It's really quite original. And although when you look at these and you think, a bit of a mess, bit difficult to understand. Once you get your eye in, there's actually an amazing amount of good detail. They're not to scale, but he has littered them with keys, a whole series of letters, and he explains what these letters stand for in terms of geographical features, in terms of military units, and in terms of the progress of the battle. The two armies standing off against each other here, an English cavalry attack against the Scots here, and all this here illustrates the flight of the Scots, all their bits and pieces as they all run like the clappers for Edinburgh, which is up the top here. And one feature I'll draw your attention to, because I think is important for our interpretation, is that he marks and describes in his text a feature called the slough. He labels it as K. There it is, very approximately north-south, if you like, a feature, a slough, a long linear feature, which there is between a force of English cavalry and the Scottish army. It's also there, not labelled, and there again, it's also here in the last drawing, labelled as K again. And that, I think, is quite significant in terms of the development of the battle. But one of the key things that that Oman did do for us is he discovered in the Bodleian Library a roll of illustrations of fighting all pasted together, which he correctly identified as being the Battle of Pinkie. And if you like, these can be interpreted like a cartoon strip. The first one, which is missing the title bit at the front, I suppose, shows a cavalry engagement on probably Carberry Hill, which took place on the 9th of September. Then the next bit shows the two armies advancing towards each other. Here's the English army coming from the left and the Scottish army coming from the right, some of it going through the streets of Musselburgh and some of it crossing the River Esk and so on, and English ships just off the coast. And then it shows an English attack on a large Scottish unit, and eventually the flight of the Scots all the way to Edinburgh. Now, some of the detail is quite remarkable. Some of it, you might argue, is quite accurate. But again, there's various challenges about it. One thing that Oman, not very helpfully, did get wrong, he found on it the name of one John Ramsay, and he therefore claimed that this must have been the work of a renegade Scot in the English army. I think it's fairly clearly the work of Sir Richard Lee or somebody close to him, one of the main commanders of the English army, who produced very similar work for other campaigns in the period, and who may have been required to produce this as an official record, if you like, what happened, or else perhaps as a cartoon for decoration, for a stately home down in England. This would be worked up for wall paintings, as there are other examples of that, or there were at Cowdray House down in England. But it is one of the most important things that have been analysed about the battle. It's presumably was done at the time of the battle, and therefore is very good documentation, you might think. But it's not clear that it's a complete work. And I think a very good case can be made that this is only some of a larger series, that actually one of the main sheets, for whatever reason, is missing. And that could quite skew how one interprets this. It's useful for actually giving you a better idea of what the armies it looked like. This is the English army, and it appears to be in about 17,000 men strong. Um, Unusually, that's a pretty accurate figure, I think, for an army. Size of armies is often, it can, sort of totally exaggerated in early accounts. But the English army consisted of three units, battles, of men armed with long-shafted weapons, bills, pikes, and there they are marching in these large square formations, preceded by their artillery, with units to each side of men armed with bows and arrows, still with handguns, and tucked in behind these units is the very considerable baggage train that accompanied the English army, with all their kit and their food and everything they needed to sustain themselves on the march. And then and the men in these three forces were probably 3,000 in two of them, 4,000 in the main one, and then making up the rest of the English army with these three large units of cavalry, of horsemen, which were a very significant part of this army. A force of light horsemen. These were guys who could ride very quickly, were not armoured. A force of men at arms, heavily armoured men, the horses armoured as well, very ponderously, but very potent force for putting against foot soldiers. And as a compromise between the two, between the men-at-arms and the light horsemen, a force of demi-lances, men who were armoured to some extent, but their horses weren't, and could either react quite quickly, or else could still be quite a force to be reckoned with. And some of the thinking behind using these different forces had been learnt by the English in wars in the previous few years in the north of France, in the region round about Boulogne. The Scots similarly were fighting in large units. The Scots, though, appear to be totally armed with pikes. Now, what is a pike? A pike is a very long spear, okay? Just a long stick with a sharp bit at the top. And we're talking about maybe 18 feet long. And if you had a well-disciplined force of men, which could face in any direction, and they could all act in unison and level their pikes, it was a very formidable force indeed that could see off even heavy cavalry men-at-arms. And that's how the Scots fought, in three large units like that. Now, the Scots were essentially an amateur army. And a case could be made that this army that advanced to fight on the 10th of September had probably never actually all fought together like this beforehand. But there is a certain amount of information on French help, input to help provide some training and backbone. And it does appear that the Scots did actually manage to manoeuvre quite well to a certain point on the day of the battle. Like the English, they had quite a considerable force of artillery, we had put quite a lot of emphasis on producing good guns. We made them in our gun foundry in Edinburgh Castle. We imported them from France. And we had a force of light cavalry, very much smaller than the English force. And we didn't have any heavy horse, any demi-lances or men-at-arms. But there we are, advancing on the 10th of September from 8 o'clock in the morning, some of them crossing the bridge, others crossing the river, and others going through the main street of Musselburgh and past Inveresk Church to line up on the high ground of Inveresk, just to the east of the River Esk. So those are the main sources that have been used, but they're not the only sources. And this is one of the things that we're quite interested in, was what could be learnt from all the other information, surviving government documentation on both sides, accounts for payments to people, diplomatic correspondence with other places in Europe, letters, accounts by people who took part in the battle, accounts by relatives, all sorts of bits of information. And there's a lot more that can be got out. And here's two which I thought were particularly interesting. This is paraphrasing an account by one Jean Wibo, who was a French Huguenot Protestant. He's actually quite famous out in Florida because in the 1560s he attempted to turn Florida into a French colony and died in the attempt. But remarkably, he was also fighting with the English at Pinkie in 1547 and left his impressions. And what he says is very interesting. If the Scots had played more for time, the English would have had to withdraw for want of food. And actually, there's lack of food in this force eventually, which was one of the main reasons why the English campaign collapsed after the battle. For an hour, it seemed that victory was in the hands of the Scots, with none of the English horsemen able or willing to tackle the Scots. The defeat was by an unbelievable misfortune. Ribot supposed that there could be nobody alive who could give a convincing explanation of how it happened, that the Scottish army just collapsed. There is actually, and I'll give it to you now, some clue as to what that could have been, part of the clue, in another, what you might regard as an unlikely source, an early mathematical treatise. Not the sort of thing you want to, that makes good bedtime reading, by the way. But here it is, a book published in London in 1579 by Leonard Digges, actually put together by his son. And it's quite an important book in mathematical terms. Now, mathematics was quite important if you were to be a successful general, because you needed to know how much land you needed to, if you're going to provide a camp for your forces for the night. And there were formulas for that. You needed to know how effective your guns were going to be, how far they could fire, have some knowledge or understanding of trajectories. And you needed to be able to do things like, so I've got a force of 10,000 pikemen and 2,000 archers. How do I draw them up? What sort of calculations do they need? You need to understand things like square roots. You need to understand, and this is what this book is largely about, is providing that sort of information for generals of the period. But in amongst it, he says, Musselburgh Field, some in the line of battle by corrupted spies or otherwise have caused rumour to be spread in the enemy's battle that the general was slain or some part of them defeated or flying away, and thereby so amazed them in the midst of the flight that they have swayed and broke. Musselburgh Field was the name that the English often gave to the Battle of Pinkie. And independently, we know from Patton's account that Leonard Digges was one of the cavalry commanders at the battle. He was there. And what he's basically saying is that when the battle got to a particular stage, the English started shouting at the Scots and saying, "Ya sucks, don't you know that your general's done a runner and he's just abandoned you?" And that the growth of that sort of rumour was instrumental in causing the Scots to think, hang on a minute, I don't want to be here much longer. And my interpretation is there's some element of truth in that is part of the explanation of what happened. And it comes from a mathematical book that you might not otherwise ever thought you would look at. In terms of, so there's lots of other sources. I can't go into all of them this evening, but there's also other post-Omen, if you like, interpretations, ways of looking at the battle. And one of the key things in military studies of more recent times has been the understanding of the idea that goes back to an historian, Michael Roberts, in the 1950s, that there was a military revolution in Europe. Um, when armies and generals in Europe and elsewhere in the world shared medieval ideas of how to fight battles and develop new weaponry, new ways of doing things. And there was an actual military revolution. And this idea of a military revolution took on big style for a great number of years and was pursued in all sorts of parts of the world. Good historians looking for evidence of it. And over the years, the idea of what it was has changed, and perhaps there has been a movement away from thinking, well, maybe it wasn't really a revolution. Maybe all we're seeing is just a sort of evolution of different ideas. And in the case of what happened at Pinkie, it's actually the case that the two armies that faced each other were possibly not that much different from the armies that confronted each other at Flodden in 1513 in terms of their equipment, their armour, the way they thought, and even the guns and so on they had. One of the key things, which was definitely different though in 1547, was Somerset's desire to create strong points, forts, to hold down a good part of the south and east of Scotland. And the first one that he erected was at Eyemouth. The English started building this, an earthwork fortification, even before in the early days of September. And these earthwork fortifications were designed in such a way that they didn't provide a target for enemy guns, and you could mount very strong artillery on them to fight out against other people. And the English did build a whole series of these earthwork fortifications, and that was part of their strategy. And that is different. They certainly made the new guns, and these forts certainly made earlier medieval castles redundant. Another thing that has been looked at as being significantly different has been the reliance in 1547 and in earlier campaigns, admittedly in 1544, by the English on ships. They probably had a force of about 70 ships that they brought up in support of their army in 1547, mostly supply ships. They'd obviously understood that I mean, they had about cavalry. 6,000 cavalry. A lot of these guys would have had more than one horse. They had meat on the hoof. They had something like 900 carts and goodness knows how many wagons as well. Can you imagine that force of animals going up, dirt tracks from Berwick through Scotland? The impact must have been enormous. And even if the Scots hadn't been wily enough to take away all their crops, how are you going to feed all that lot? So the English were trying, obviously, to have a lot of the supplies on their ships. But one of the, if you like, controversial, interesting issues, which has been talked about by a number of people, is did the English ships have an effect on the actual battle? Were the Scots forced to move their troops on the 10th of September because they were being fired on, particularly by one ship in particular, the so-called galley Suttle, a large Mediterranean galley that was actually built by Henry VIII. It was an interesting experiment. And there is some evidence that shots from it did go into the Scottish ranks. My own view is that it probably wasn't really that influential in the outcome of the battle, but and there's an argument if the galley could fire on the Scots with considerably more artillery could fire on the galley. These sort of things are a two-way process. Okay. The cavalry we've touched upon how important they were, but spare a thought for the Scottish light horse, who have been totally dismissed by Oman. I mean, Oman suggested that they were so defeated on the 9th of September, and they were seen off by the English cavalry in an encounter on the 9th of September. He even suggests that they were so down that they probably didn't even turn up on the 10th, which I think is not sustainable from the evidence. And one of the things to think about is that in the aftermath of the battle, when Scotland basically became, if you like, a French colony, and the French put a lot of money and support into rescuing us from the English, the only part of the Scottish military establishment that the French thought was worth supporting financially was a light horseman. They kept the force on foot, and it even took them to France. That doesn't sound like they were total waste of time. Artillery, I've mentioned, artillery played an important part on both sides in the battle. This is a contemporary copperplate engraving. And the English had a significant force of handgunners. You see them here advancing into battle against the Scots. Now, one of the intriguing things here is that it looks pretty clear that the Scots did not have handgunners at the battle. And I don't understand why, because all the evidence from other sources suggests that the Scots were well supplied with units of handgunners at this time, and there were lots of handguns that were being manufactured. So I do wonder if, for some reason I don't understand, a decision was made not to employ handgunners in their fighting. And one of the possible reasons for that is another thing where I think Ullman and other commentators have very badly misled us. There are comments that there were a force of uh, Irish, meaning Highland, archers at Pinkie, um, who were so ineffective and so useless that they probably didn't even come to fight, that they ran away. And they were particularly ran away when somebody fired a gun because they didn't like loud noises. And I think this is a particularly unfortunate um, bit of misinformation because the evidence is fairly clear, I think, that these Irish archers did take part in the fighting on the 10th of September. Not only did they take part, they were actually the most professional part of the Scottish Army. These were the warriors from the west of Scotland, from the Isles and the Argyll, who did all the fighting in Ireland, who were paid, who many people in the English army probably were really scared of. They were probably really feared them. And it's interesting that we have this other early French account of the fighting in Scotland at the time. And here's some of the things that they say. Clad in dyed shirts and light woolen blankets of several colours. This is your original tartan-clad warriors. This is the first time we hear of these in battle, and it's probably at Pinkie, okay? They incited themselves to battle by the sound of their bagpipes. Yeah. And they showed, and this is talking about the siege of Haddington, by the way, in 1548, they showed no fear of the English, but threw themselves to the ground when artillery was fired. Now, it's that bit about throwing themselves to the ground when artillery was fired that has been latched upon to show that they were useless and, were not of any account. But come on now. I mean, these guys were professional enough and intelligent enough to know to duck when somebody was firing big guns at them. And they had plenty of experience of using guns themselves in the West and in Ireland. I think they've been totally discounted. And one of the main accounts of what happened at the end of the battle describes how there's only one unit of Scots that managed to keep together and leave the battlefield untouched by the English. It was these guys, okay? So, and was the battle inevitable? Now we're running out of time here. There's all, you might think two big armies, within eyeball to eyeball to each other. There was bound to be a fight, and there was no way of avoiding it. Not so. There were two large armies, English and Scottish, probably largely the same guys, traversing this land in 1544. And in 1548, a combined French and Scottish army drew up next to Inverness Church in exactly the same place as the Scots drew up on the morning of the 10th of September and saw off a large English relieving army which had attempted to relieve the siege of Haddington, where they had a force in at that time. Um, and the English just slunk away, and the French and Scots let them do so. So that was a possible outcome, if you like. They didn't have to fight. But by the way, all this military activity makes it harder, to actually, if you do identify something militarily happening in this area, how do you know if it's 1544, 1547, or 1548? You don't actually, and even the same people were taking part. Anyway, one of the key things in terms of trying to understand the battle, I think, is the account by Patton and nobody else of how there was a slough on the slopes, if you like, of Fosside Hill, where this up against which or near which the advancing Scots stood on about midday, if you like, on the 10th of September. And they were positioned there to help ward off an attack by the English cavalry, including heavy cavalry. And the Scottish vanguard successfully beat off the English and wreaked quite heavy bloodshed on them. Now if you look in English dictionaries, you'll find that a slough can mean a variety of different things. It can mean boggy ground, for instance, but it can also mean a linear feature, a ditch of some sort, not a river, not a canal, but some sort of course, normally with water in it. And that, I think, is what Patton's descriptions say and what he is showing on his map. A linear feature, perhaps marking the division between the rough grazing and the crops being grown in Inveresk fields. It was a feature which provided some defence for the advancing Scots and was a big enough feature to be an obstacle to English cavalry, but not to stop them crossing it. And our interpretation in our book is that that slough can be identified as this feature here, this sort of ditch area, full of trees now, Colton Dean, which is on the slopes of Fosside Hill in the background here. And it was here that the Scots army, the Scottish advancing vanguard, made its stand against an English cavalry charge and saw them off, and almost sort of caused the total collapse of the English army. It was a difficult moment, and the Scots were rightly quite cock-a-hoop. And as Ribot, our French Huguenot, said, it looked very much like the Scots would win a famous victory. Now, we don't have the time to actually describe all this in detail, but in the book, which I hope if you haven't read it, you will read, we do provide an outline, our best interpretation of the various movements on the 9th of September, when there was a cavalry engagement, and on the 10th September, when the Scottish army engaged with the English, and then eventually did a runner. And we've related this to the modern landscape. You can see most of it in council house estates and so on in that general region. So what happened? Why did the Scots grab defeat from the jaws of victory? Well, there's so much we don't know. We've got quite a lot of information on what the English intended to do. They wanted to beat the Scots into submission. They wanted to take our queen. They wanted to have us as our Protestant friends and see off the French. We don't know what the Scots wanted, what Arne particularly wanted, apart from to defend Edinburgh and see the back of the English. And when he actually brought his army out in the morning of the 10th to face up to the English, and then decided to maneuver his army towards Fosside Hill, the higher ground, it's not altogether clear what he was thinking. But what I think is key to the end result of the battle is that, having seen off the English cavalry attack and being quite jubilant, the Scots thought they could turn their army to face the English foot units, which were probably very inexperienced and not well trained. And the Scots, okay, up to then had managed to keep the units together, and were quite well positioned, but they were too close together. And in their efforts to turn their three units of foot and their archers and their artillery and everything else round to face the English, they were too close together. And they couldn't form a line. And they were so close together that the only way out for some of them was actually to actually withdraw from the line. And the English saw what was happening and rushed forward with archers and gunners to take advantage of this chaos. And it's probably at that point that there was much name calling has happened in these battles, saying, yeah, your general's just done a runner, just done a runner. Why are you guys still here? That sort of catcalling of stuff. And it had an effect. And eventually there was an unrolling of the army and they fled. So there's no getting away from the fact that it was a great victory for the English, and we were stuffed, and that was that, you might think. But was it such an English victory, really? Because the English failed to get any benefit from it. They were outplayed actually by Arne and Mary of Guise, the Queen Mother, in terms of diplomacy. And Somerset didn't even manage to get the Scots to come and treat with them. His supply bases in Scotland were very poorly supplied. He had tremendous problems with food. He had tremendous problems with the weather. And within years, Somerset and the other English commanders literally lost their heads as their policy was seen to be a massive failure. Meanwhile, the Earl of Arne lived to what would have been seen as a ripe old age and was given a French dukedom. And as the 16th century went on, many things changed, not least our reliance actually on the English to help us see through events. Some of the very commanders who fought against us at Pinkie in 1547 helped us remove the French administration at Leith in 1561. And we relied on English intervention, for instance, in 1573 to get rid of the last remnants of the supporters of Mary, Queen of Scots, and ultimately to achieve the succession of our James VI to the English throne. We Scots maybe, or some of us maybe got what we wanted. The English probably didn't. There's a lot more to unwrap from that, but there's some of the things to think about. I hope you'll find that of interest. Thank you very much.